Yeah, you can go ahead.
Okay, so we're going to review what we have touched on earlier today. Um, so what we spoke about is that we saw how the southern side of America uh, had a church and state model. So the battleground was not happening on the south, but was happening on the north. And what uh, we looked at is that Christ was to return before 1863 if it was not the history of failure. The United States would have been a church and state relationship if the South won. If God's people have been successful, then the Sunday law in the history of compromise movement of 1850 should have been a success as well. So if the Millerites or the SDA, actually, if the Millerites, they were not, uh, if the Millerites had not failed, then Christ was to come back even before 1863. Another way to express it is that the Adventist story is a success, which means the South story would have been a success as well. If the Adventist story during that time, or let's just say that when the Adventist story becomes a success, the the South would have been a success, and the Sunday law we would have had a national Sunday law. Long before 1840, the South had already united on a church and state model. They already had an they had already had an inscrutable Southern identity. In the mid to late 1700s, ministers traveled south to evangelize, and they taught the South that slavery was wrong. So evangelists from the north, they were traveling to the south to teach the South that slavery was wrong. They settled and became more comfortable in the South. They started making friends and taking pride in being Southerners. And they knew the North was watching them over slavery. And these ministers started getting defensive and they started arguing, saying slavery was ideal. But you Northerners are judgmental and authoritarian. Stop telling us what we should do. Focus on your own problems. And the North took an even stronger stance on slavery and progressive acceptance of slavery until the moment when we come to civil war. They declare that slavery is biblical, mainly partly out of their own regional and pride. The South has come together through a certain identity. They were successful due to their limited economy. So that's how they establish a church and state on the south parts of it. And really, when the North tried to influence them because they were sending ministers to the south, usually what would happen is that the ministers which they would send to the south to convince the southerners that slavery is wrong, what would happen is that it would be the other way around, where you find that the northern ministers would be converted instead. The religion practiced in the South was almost unified. Churches control schools and colleges and university. Very little immigration from the North, so there was not much immigration from the North. Very little immigration from overseas. Very small rural communities. So I guess they were very strict on migration, or people just didn't want to go to the South because of uh, them keeping slavery and their strict laws. All of this created a strong identity that has become in, in, impenetrable. They already had a church and state relationship. And if the South had been successful, this model would have been imposed on the whole of the United States. But by the time we come to the story of 1863, the South has failed. The struggle is the North. And the South, even after losing the Civil War with national pride, they had more, withdrew into himself even more. And this situation begins to divide in the days of Billy Graham, which is during 1979 until the Sunday Law. The second point we have made is that Protestantism tends to be divided. This separation can be traced back to the First Great Awakening, and this is what we studied. These are the studies that were done in the Oceana Camp meeting. Many things we studied build on what we have already taught. So this is the studies of in God we trust. We discuss how the two streams of Protestantism could be symbolized by two key of American Protestant University, which is Princeton and Oberlin. And we will find them in our studies. We are finishing with our review. So we are looking at how the Constitution became Christian. And this document, okay. Okay, before I speak about how the Constitution became Christian, we also spoke about the three structures, which is modern Israel, the counterfeit, and Protestantism. In God we trust. So in these structures, we see it's a failure, success for all the three groups. And we also spoke about Charles Finney and Charles Hodge. Charles Finney was a progressive minister or a scholar, and then Charles Hodge was a conservative minister or scholar in Princeton. So right in the beginning of our modern Israel history, we see these two streams of information beginning to build up in around 1700s and 1798 in time of the end. Then we also spoke about the the group threats that the South find as a threat to their constitution or their way of life. And these are the Jews, Catholics, Mormons, and SDAs, and free thinkers. So yeah, we are going to look at this document, how the Constitution became Christian. And on this presentation, we will be mostly reading. I've made it easier and took down the quotes that will be read. But if you do want the book, or yeah, the book which was sent on the media podcast, I'll send it again on the group. But I've just made it easier for us so that we can we don't spend more time in these, but focus on important points. So the chapter 3 of this book, the constitutional nationalism of the new Christian rights, is divided into 3 subparts, which is the group threats, which talks about the threats, and then sub B talks about nationalist and mobilization, how the Southern they mobilize, and subpart C, which talks about constitutional requirements. So these are the requirements to changing the constitution. So this is what we'll be looking at in this presentation, especially the group threats, subparts A. So the 5 threats, they are the Catholics, Adventists, and the Jews, the Mormons, and free thinkers. So we're going to read on page 67, and this topic is no mention of God in the Constitution. So, okay, reading. The US Constitution contains no expression of religious devotion, making it an anomaly, anomaly in US constitutional tradition. In contrast, the Declaration of Independence states that all men are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, invokes the laws of nature and of the God of nature, and appeals to the supreme judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions. This is taken from how the Constitution became Christian. Okay, then the next, we're going to paraphrase from how the Constitution became Christian. Same page 267. Some evangelical Christians opposed rectification because the Constitution gave no special status to Christianity. Martin Luther, a dissenting delegate to the Constitutional Convention, opposed the religious oath clause because he felt that in a Christian country, it would be at least decent to draw a distinction between teachers of Christianity and the outright infidelity of paganism. And then page 268. Some anti-federalists have argued that under the Constitution, Jews, Mohammedans, Gentiles, etc., may be elected to federal office, and that therefore the Constitution would serve as an invitation to Jews and heathens of every kind to gather amongst us. And then the next paragraph on the same page, long after ratification, many evangelicals continue to oppose the Constitution due to the lack of expression of religious devotion. And then 5 lines down, we'll start with the Reverend Chaunisi Lee, in Sermon of 1813, declared that the Constitution has not the mark of religion, not the slightest recognition of government or of the being of God. I will hold to this alone reflection. If God is not in the camp, have we not the reason to tremble for the ark? And then he quotes the Reverend Erza Stiles Eli. Then, in 1844, former President John Quincy Adams, while in Congress, presented a petition to amend the Constitution to contain a clear and explicit recognition of the sovereign of the universe as the God of the nation, full and avowed submission to the Lord Jesus Christ as the ruler of the nation. 37. The petition was filed without recorded debate. Okay, let me just, okay. The Covenanters reject the Constitution as blasphemous. So the Reformed Personage Church, a radical group of the Scot-Irish Presbyterians, commonly known as the Covenanters, was among the groups that continued to reject the Constitution as a blasphemous document. So they agreed they agreed with John Adams putting God in the Constitution. Civil War and the birth of the National Reform Association. So, although they have been long-standing expression of opposition to the godless Constitution, it took the Civil War to spark a movement to put God in the Constitution. In the North, war was described as the punishment for national sin of the slave. Southern ministers held that the absence of an expression of religious devotion in the American Constitution had been a national sin, and the adoption of the new Confederate Constitution of March 1861 gave them the opportunity to write it. The South could say it had God on its side because the Constitution said, unlike the North. So this was also another their reasoning capacity to amending the Constitution or to making the Constitution Christian. In 1863, a movement began in the North to put God in the Constitution as well. In February of that year, members of the 11 Protestant denomination met in China, Ohio, to discuss the spiritual implications of the war. The group was dominated by the Covenanters and, consistent with their belief, concluded that the war was divine punishment. So, as you can remember that the South is already a church and state. We can say they already have a church and state relationship. So now the fight is happening in the northern part, and it's these reforms that are happening in the northern parts that are attempting to change this constitution. In doing so, or by pursuing their agenda, Christian amendment supporters wanted to make it clear we the people are the Christian people. The Christian people. The proposed amendment quickly received several prominent supporters, including Senators Charles Sumner, B. Gratz Brown, and John Sherman, as well as The Independent, the nation's leading religious journal, and the faculty of Princeton Theological Seminar, the nation's leading seminary. Okay. Okay. Let me also mention this point. All that comes out of this group of these 11 denominations con is the covenanters who came together and called this meeting, who introduced their beliefs, drove their agenda. And what came out of those meetings was consistent with the belief of the covenanters. They say slavery is wrong, but the crowning original sin of the nation is omission of God from the Constitution. Led by the Covenanters, the National Reform Association was created. So it's through these uh, Covenanters that the National Reform Association was uh, created. Excuse me. Excuse me. Uh, we'll now we'll we'll not go into details on this. We'll read page 271, and yeah. So to continue, the movement that emerged in the late 1860 was different in that it was less sectarian and more political. Religious amendment of the Constitution is not and of itself the end we seek, wrote the Christian statement. It is but a means to an end, that the end is the awakening and combining of the Christian people of America into a compact, enthusiastic, and determined movement to realize the religious idea of the government in all its application. So here the Covenanters, they were arguing that uh, the reason they had a civil war in 1863 was not because uh, of slavery, like it was God's punishment, but not because there was slavery in the United States, but because the the but because there was no God in the Constitution. So the Constitution, that's what they believe. They believe that the Constitution needed uh needed to be Christian. Yes, basically. Uh Towards the end of the Civil War, when the Union was winning, the movements began to lose ground, and the journal, The Independence, the main religious magazine of the country, says that the members of the National Reform Movement are all fanatics. The main sources of Protestantism declare this movement to be fanatical, and some of the key elements are beginning to withdraw their supporters. They started out being successful and now they are losing ground. In 1867, they undertook a major structural reform. The same year, they began to publish a Christian statement. The Christian statement, if you read A.T. Jones, he has been against the document for most of his career. So yeah, this is the state what the religious amendment of the Constitution is not in and of itself the end we seek, wrote the Christian statement. Okay. So this is how they try to amend the Constitution, amending the Constitution, the fine print. So after the Covenanters came NRA, the National Reform Association, and they'll be playing a big role when it comes to amending the constitution. But obviously, we know that this history, and this is the history of 1863 until 1888, we know that it's the history of failure. So they won't win when it comes to amending the constitution. Once they amend the constitution, they can set a Christian identity on stone. Then the government, the three branches, the legislative, judicial, and executive, is forced to function according to the constitution and to carry the religious idea. What is the practical application? What is the fine print? These are the religious oath of office, blasphemy laws, the Sunday law. They established the religion here in the Constitution Amendment. What is the fine print? Laws against blasphemy. Remember, they interpreted the blasphemy as anything that speaks against the Protestant belief. Their fight against abortion is more recent, and I'm not sure if it was happening back then. If we move forward in the application of the Sunday law, it is those things that are the fine prints. Can you see how the elements placed to be able to attack the threats? The Catholics, Jews, free thinkers, and Adventists and Mormons. So it's these religious oath, laws of blasphemy, and Sunday law, especially Sunday law, that are attacking these other groups, the Catholics, Jews, free thinkers, Adventists, and Mormons. If you institute a Sunday law, you get rid of Adventists, Jews, and free thinkers. If you institute blasphemy laws, you get rid of the whole thing. You won't be able to lecture on the daughters of Babylon, not how they interpret blasphemy. So another point that I want to make is that Adventism think that the Protestant or Protestantism have a relationship with the Catholics, but in this history, it's different, and we see that there's a fight between Protestants and the Pope. With the religious oath of office, it was impossible for the Catholic to be president. I think my outlook growing up, my training in Adventist education broadly has been similar to yours. I hope some of the stuff breaks. When Ellen G. White said in a parabolic language that there will be that hand across the chasm, Protestantism and Catholics, the Vatican agreed in 1893. They responded to the Protestants with a mockery. They said, "You Protestants think you have your foot on the neck, but look what you are doing. You pay us homage." This is the Sunday law. "You belong to us." It's not friendship in the story of 1888. Friendship did not exist between Catholics and Protestants. 1893, the Catholic Church responded to what the Protestants were doing. You find that the Catholics said in the writing of the pioneers, all these Adventists today building their faith on the 1888 story, waiting for the World Ecumenical Council to unite the Pope Francis, and they will be friends. God is trying to tell us that we don't understand the story of 1888 and that they will never be friends. So Protestantism will never see a point in history where Protestantism and Catholics come together to make a Sunday law, declare a national Sunday law. Their Sunday law paid homage to the papacy. At the same time, they thought that they were in struggle with the papacy in 1863 and 1900. Then the Sunday Law, Protestantism and Catholics are not friends. So why are we so concerned to see the struggle between Protestantism and the papacy today? They were fighting in our favorite story. So why wouldn't Francis and the Christian right movement fight today? The Catholic Church responds today saying, no matter what you believe, you may think you are winning, but Protestantism do us a homage. For you keep following our 1260 example, you just copy what we have done. What is the expression that says the greatest form of respect? So this is imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So the Catholic says we are flattered, we are flattered that you imitate us, even if the Protestant think overthrowing the Catholic in the United States. So this is what we see, that the Catholics actually, they are mocking the Protestants with wanting to amend the constitution to Sunday laws and making it Christian, because they're just pointing back to the Dark Ages. There is no evidence either in there is no evidence in either the inspiration of history that there is some hidden deep states operating behind the scenes between the 1888 papacy and the Protestantism. How our way of thinking has been twisted by a time of desperation leading us to the Protestantism idolatry. This is how powerful the 1888 history is, if understood correctly. So I hope everyone is following, and we are all together when it comes to this. So when we're looking at our Sunday law, the Sunday law that's going to come, we know that we're not going to see Protestantism and the Catholics coming together, because this is not going to happen. But what we see is that the Catholics, they are saying that the Protestants are giving homage to what they used to do in the Dark Ages. So before I move on quickly, I just want to highlight these points. The Covenanters call a meeting. They're afraid that the United States has committed this premium sin. The Constitution is a sin. 11 different denominations come together, and they are considered radical, bigoted by the mainstream Protestantism. But they are starting a publication. They are restructuring. They're becoming politically active and begin a struggle that will last for decades. So during 1888, these covenanters, or the covenanters, or NRA, they start to begin a political movement within the United States. So amending the Constitution. This sin must be settled in the Constitution. Remove the threat of group of these 5 identities through the fine print of amendment to the Constitution. Just a question: which branch of government makes the decision on how to interpret the Constitution? So which branch in the government makes decision on how to interpret the constitution. So we have the legislative, we have the judicial, we have the executive. So the one that interprets, it's the judicial branch, or the Supreme Court. When the Protestants wanted the constitution amended, the Supreme Court would have been forced to read it their way. So during that time, wanted the constitution to be amended. So obvious, a constitution is amended in the legislations or the legislative. So if the legislative became a Christian document, the constitution, they would have forced, even if the Supreme Court during that time was liberal, they would have forced the Supreme Court to interpret these laws the way they wanted to. But because that history, again, it's the history of failure, this couldn't happen. The Constitution failed to amend the Constitution to be Christian. But then in our history, they wanted the Constitution to be interpreted their way. All they had to do was to make sure that the Supreme Court that interpreted the same way they did, to make sure the 3 points were done: religious oath, blasphemy law, and the Sunday law. Yeah, so I did cover this, that the Covenanters, they are starting a publication, they are restructuring, they become politically active, and they begin a struggle that will last for decades. And then in this history, in our history, I could say from 1979 to Sunday law, interpreting the Constitution, because they failed to amend the Constitution, they now interpret the Constitution. And the people who interpret the Constitution, it's the judicials or the Supreme Court. And that history, we saw it happen during the presidency of Donald Trump. And then we saw that Billy Graham changed from saying that they are Protestantism, or they are the National Reform Association, to evangelicals. So you needed different laws to keep your foot in the necks of different groups of people. But in our history, they need to interpret, spread this interpretation, place judges in the Supreme Court who will judge according to their interpretation. Can you see how everything is already in place? How blind Adventism is? Because if it was an amendment, Adventism would have already woken up. So Adventism are looking for amending the Constitution. Even today, they still think that the Constitution will be amended. But this, we know that it's not going to happen, but it has already happened through the Supreme Justice. But because Adventism do not understand the structures, they are waiting for an amendment that will never come. And the Sunday law is already in place. The Protestants have already succeeded. If this group needed an amendment, it would either have already been amended or be about to be. And all that would be instituted to the Sunday law would have been a fine print. Okay, now we're going to read page 273. I'm going to paraphrase because we have very little time. The struggles they had was because they had certain clause, oath of office, blasphemy laws, Sunday laws. In the state laws, and then in the new groups, the Jews, free thinkers, Adventists, Catholics, Mormons were already fighting against these laws. So this is the history of 1888, that they are already fighting against these laws. And there was a danger that the Protestantism would lose that fight. And that was mainly because of immigration. Catholics were finding their way. They were becoming politically organized, and demographics of the nation were changing. But just like today, what threatens the identity is immigration. And in the last sentence of this page, so yeah, we're going to read. Many Protestants understood that the demands of religious freedom expressed by the Catholics and other minorities amounted to a demand for the subjugation of the Protestant majority. In the 19th century, public education was generally non-sectarian in that it elicited generic Protestantism rather than providing education associated with a particular Protestant sect. 72 public schools generally use the King James Bible to teach moral lessons to the public, and moral reading of the Bible was common in 73 public schools. During the second half of the 19th century, demands to remove the Bible from schools and to make them less Protestantism multiplied. Catholics, Seventh-day Adventists, Jews, and free thinkers considered teaching of Protestant morals and scriptures in public school to be in conflict with principles of equality and separation of the church and states. Yes, so generic Protestantism was taught in public school. The groups, the Jews, free thinkers, Adventists, Catholics, Mormons, began to fight against the action based on the principles of equality and separation of church and state. Like the South in the Civil War, Protestants say they are the ones to be protected. They are the ones who are subjugated. There is a war in Christianity. I quote a person at the bottom of page 274. In challenging the reading of the Bible in schools, Sunday observance laws and bans on blasphemy, opponents of the Christian amendments were waging bitter war against all remnant of the national religion which we have left. Have you heard of the Christmas war? Protestants are convinced today that there is a war against Christmas. It is a ridiculed argument, but all of this is the reflection of what is happening today. In page 275, who are the people who plot against Protestantism? These are the atheists, infidels, communists, and Catholics. The deist, Jews, Baptists of the Seventh Day, because none of them are considered Christians. But regardless of the group in which we place them, one fact was clear. All those attacking Christianity were foreigners. The majority of the threats came from immigrants who were not prototype Americans. So this is what they believe, that these were not ideal Americans or Christians. And reading from page 275. And who were these people who plot against Protestant practice? Some pointed atheists and infidels, communists and papists, atheists and deists, Jews and the Seventh-day Baptists. Those who challenged Christian practices were almost entirely foreign imports and relatively recent. All these elements lead us to part B of the document, when the author will discuss the connection between the group threats theory of Protestantism and how all relates to the national Protestantism. Will not only have to defend its religion, but America as well. it is this part that I plan to stop with the document and discuss who they were, the Covenanters. They were the first immigrants from Scotland. Okay, so we have covered uh, most part of this presentation that I was supposed to do today, especially the subpart A that talks about the threats. And then these threats being the Catholics, Adventists, the Jewish, and the Mormons, and free thinkers, and how the Covenanters really uh, wanted to their reason behind changing the constitution and seeing these groups as a threat. So yeah, in the next presentation, uh, this part is going to discuss more who the uh, Covenanters are, and then but for now we'll end at the conclusion of part A. This whole part was just an explanation of the threatened group, and we would like to look at the branch of Protestantism which is struggling to understand who it is, because a part of Protestantism thinks that it is only about fanatics. So I believe this is an established. I believe that this is an established in my mind more than ever before, and I hope this is for you as well. The first work has already been done interpreting the Constitution, and people don't know it. Now it's just the fine print that got to happen. Because as the NRA, the National Reform Association, said, amend the Constitution is not the end goal, it is a means to an end. The Sunday law is our final goal, and we are close to it. But it is by understanding that this history that we'll be able to see that it looks like this is not a friendship between Jerry Falwell Jr. and the Pope Francis. This one is not going to happen. As we said before, and I already forget, the greatest way to pay homage is to imitate. And what Protestants have always sought to imitate is the 1260 years, whether be by buying or selling man or woman, body and soul, or by imposing the observance of Sunday through something else. So Ellen White said that the Sunday law thrives in darkness. Interpret those words in 1888 and then define for me what that darkness was like in 1888. Then read all that A.T. Jones wrote about in the Sunday law and how visibly progressing it was. Then we'll look at the quotes again. So my presentation ends here. I don't know if there are any questions or comments before we close in prayer. Did everyone understand uh, this presentation? And it's always good that we go back to these presentation and yeah, so that we refresh our mind to always uh, follow the right path and not fall in the wicked world below. So if there are no any questions or comments, I would then close with the word of prayer. Okay. We'll kneel. Dear Lord, we see how close we are. We see how far we have come, how blind Adventism is. The subject of these studies is not directly equality, but we are looking at a movement in the time of trouble. And to human eyes, it seems a failure. All around us, we practice sexism. We see that we don't have Illuminate to have a voice club in this movement. We started our own clubs, and it's so easy to think that fellowship is ready to do work, but it doesn't matter who's there, because you said in your word, I pray, Lord, that you don't make these things a success, because we know they will, but people see the serious need to look to themselves to get to the standard and understand that they don't have no freedom. We did not give You did not give us freedom any more than you gave America to practice slavery. You dictated their behavior. You tell us what our behavior should be. We don't want souls to be lost, but I pray that everyone, board members and viewer and all the board members and everyone see the lack of choice with reasonable eyes. May all come to the standard to pass the test so that they are none lost. We approach you on your Sabbath. We solemnly look at the condition in which we find ourselves and pray, Lord, that you will give us the messages, the power for identifying the conservative, this nationalism, this sexism. May we repent and change, because it is already almost late and some people have already made their hard choice. Give us the courage to hold on to your truth and hold these ropes throughout our time of trouble. I pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.